With last week's update, I spoke about how I think the gunplay changes are moving Battlefield 6 in the right direction, but I still don't think the gunplay is in a great spot, and there are definitely some changes I'd like to see with how the game handles randomness. And to be clear, I'm not saying Battlefield 6 needs perfectly laser-beamed weapons. Randomness can have a place in gunplay, but if it exists, players need to be able to read it, understand it, and ultimately be able to control and counter it in a skillful way. So for this video, I want to break down the difference between what I think is good and bad randomness, why stacking bloom and recoil can make gunfights feel more inconsistent, and why I think Battlefield 6 should pick one main system, make it more readable, and allow the attachments to support that system. Starting off, I do believe there's a difference between good and bad randomness. Good randomness can aid in balancing weapons, such as stopping automatic weapons from being too effective at long range, and creating reasons to tap and burst fire or just slowing down instead of holding the trigger. This can help create more weapon variety. For example, one gun can be better for short controlled burst, while another might be better for slightly longer range sustained fire. The problem I have is with what I'm going to consider bad randomness, which is when a player feels like they did everything right, but the game ultimately still gives them an inconsistent result. If I'm aiming well, pacing my shots correctly, and controlling the weapon, but the gun still feels unpredictable and the end results are still unpredictable, this takes away from that skill feeling and just creates feelings of frustration. This is where I think Battlefield 6 starts to run into problems. They implement bloom and random recoil, which are both just random systems as a whole. Bloom affects where bullets can land around your point of aim, while random recoil affects how the weapon moves between shots. I think either of these systems can work, but stacking them both together just can make gunfights feel harder to read, and it creates more inconsistency between weapons. Sure, this can add to weapons feeling more distinct from one another, but I think the inconsistencies there kind of outweigh this pro. Because right now, if I miss a shot, what was the reason? Did I hold the trigger too long? Did my bloom get too wide? Or did the recoil randomly kick off target? This is where gunplay starts feeling inconsistent to me, because the issue here is not simply that randomness exists. The issue is when there are multiple layers of randomness, it's hard for us as players to clearly understand what happened at times. So I think Battlefield 6 should pick one primary randomness system and build around that. If bloom stays, then it needs to be clearly readable and controllable. Players should be able to tap or burst fire to keep the weapon accurate, the reticle should communicate when the gun is becoming less accurate, and the reset should be fast enough that slowing down actually matters. This is where the strength of bloom in some of the older Battlefield games came into play. You could counter it by pacing your shots. The downside was that bullets could go away from the center of the screen, which made it harder to read and being less accessible overall, especially for newer players. So, on the other hand, if random recoil is the option here, then I think bloom should be reduced or removed entirely. Random recoil could serve the same balancing role that bloom used to serve. This means limiting sustained fire while also rewarding controlled bursts. The big advantage of using random recoil instead of bloom here is that it's more readable. Instead of bullets randomly leaving the reticle, the weapon itself would be more visibly harder to control, therefore letting players know when it was kicking in. This means as players, we can see the reticle or sight start to move and understand that we're overfiring and we need to stop or pause briefly to let the weapon reset before firing again. This would give the player direct and immediate feedback, increasing accessibility and lessening frustration, especially when compared to bloom. A faster reset would reward quick tap firing, while a slower reset would encourage burst firing. And some weapons could be tuned to handle longer sustained fire before they become unstable. This would give each weapon a rhythm without making the gunplay feel like pure randomness. And this is where I see attachments playing a role in this, by helping players slightly reshape how weapons handle. Some attachments could improve the default consistency of a weapon, making it better at what it already does. So if a gun is naturally built around burst firing, you could build more into that, making those bursts more consistent. But the attachment system could also allow players to push the weapon slightly in the opposite direction. For example, if a gun is more burst fire oriented by default, maybe attachments can make it a little more forgiving for sustained fire. Or if a gun is better at sustained fire, then attachments could help improve its reset speed, thus making it a little more useful for tap firing. This would allow players to adjust weapons to better fit their playstyle without completely erasing weapon identity. Because I don't think if a gun is built around burst firing, it should just become as good at sustained firing as well, especially if the weapon was not designed for that from the start, but the attachments can be utilized to give players some flexibility here, ultimately allowing players to shape the weapon's rhythm, but not turning every gun into the same exact weapon. So I think my stance here is pretty simple. BF6 doesn't necessarily need to remove all randomness from gunplay, but I do think it needs to avoid stacking too many random systems at once. If Bloom is going to be the main system moving forward, then they need to make sure that it is readable and allowing for tap or burst firing to matter. If random recoil is going to be the main system, however, then making it visible, making it resettable, and allowing players to control it through timing. Because I don't see randomness as automatically bad, but unreadable and uncontrollable randomness is. So the best gunplay to me is not when every weapon is a laser beam, but it's when players are able to understand, learn their rhythm, and feel like they have better control, which actually leads to better results. So would you rather BF6 pick one main accuracy system, like Bloom or random recoil, or should the game remove most randomness and balance weapons through recoil, damage, and range instead? Be sure to let me know down in the comments below. I'll catch you on the next one. RAMTEID out.